Hello and welcome to My Property World. I'm Will Mallard, and today we're joined on this last panel interview of 2021 by Logan Ransley, Sue Maxwell Smith and Phil Turtle. Logan, do you want to introduce yourself and Landlord Studio as the sponsors of today's show?
Yep, for sure. So co-founder of Landlord Studio. We're a rental accounting and property management tool for helping landlords that typically self-manage to automate a lot of the business tasks in their business, as well as allowing them to keep track of their financial position for the tax season.
Okay, I'm a landlord and property investor of 30 years standing, and I own and run an accounting practice with a specialism in property.
You're very welcome. And Phil?
Hi, Phil Turtle, Compliance Director with Landlord Licensing and Defence. We do two things. We help people to get their properties compliant with all the hundreds of regulations and legislations out on the ground, and we also help them defend themselves against councils who get somewhat aggressive and a bit greedy for massive fines.
So you're all very welcome, and today we're going to be talking about the Tenant Fees Act and how it affects landlords. Now, what we're looking to cover off, do you want to run through the general thread of it, Logan, and just give a flavour for what we're looking to ask? And I'm sure there'll be some curly variants come out of it from the different angles.
Yeah, for sure. So Tenant Fees Act was introduced a few years ago and essentially prohibits landlords and agents from charging fees to tenants that are not permitted inside the Act. So what we want to do today is just discuss why it was introduced and I guess what some of those fees you can charge the tenant and you cannot charge the tenant, and potentially some of those penalties that may apply to landlords that are charging fees that are not under that Act. And would love to hear some stories from everyone on the panel here about their experience with that, or of people that you know that have had experience with that before.
So in terms of why was it introduced? So there's a consistent theme that we've been talking about in previous podcasts, where the government is wanting to professionalise the business of being a landlord. They're wanting effectively to over time move a category of tax into limited companies. So where people hold second, third, fourth properties, that they move them into limited companies because there's I suppose a relatively higher level of visibility. There's an ability to stay on top of it from HMRC's point of view that perhaps or is perceived as harder to do as a country. Now, in line with that, there's an increasing expectation around housing standards and the process of building, maintaining and letting and the ongoing management aspects of being a landlord are being professionalised in parallel with that. Now, what does it mean is another thing altogether. Now, Sue Maxwell Smith, I think I cut you off in the intro. My apologies, but you're one of the curators and indeed, I suppose the head person in UK property world, which is
that was what I was going to add on to my intro.
So over 13,000 very experienced landlords in a Facebook group, and they talk about stuff constantly. And your role is to, I suppose, to partly set them straight and also to keep the conversation going. So what does this all mean? for landlords, and what's the sort of themes that you've been seeing as far as tenant fees go?
Well, I think a lot of the fuss about it has died down in the last couple of years since it was introduced. The first year was it was very much the topic of the year. But I do believe that it's another one of these things that's been brought on partially, if not wholly, by ever increasing fee. You know what I mean? It kind of got out of control in that certain letting agents were really soaking the tenant as well as the landlord. And there was a huge growth in letting agents because it was a profitable business. And then overnight, it went completely the other way. And each of those, of course, had a knock on both to tenants and to landlords. And now the overhead of a landlord has risen markedly because he carries all the fees. He has to feed the letting agent. I think more letting agents are adding secret commissions, if you want to call it that, off the tradesmen because they have to eat. And it was, you know, it was like going cold turkey, and there's always a health effect after that. So I don't think it comes up so much now. Not in discussion. There may be some disgruntled tenants, but we don't have many on our group.
Yeah, and in terms of like that's the nature of economy. Someone has to pay somewhere. If you have, but of course
that person is the tenant. It's another tenant tax, isn't it? This one, effectively, because it will almost certainly have knocked into rents.
So what were some examples of tenant fees that were charged prior to this act, and why were they deemed unsuitable or not necessary for leasing or renting to tenants?
So like a typical example was there were application fees. So if you had multiple tenants applying for a property, and if you think about some of the city locations that were popular, you could have dozens of people applying for the same property, of which only one group of them could have potentially lived in the property, and multiple application fees, and you had screening fees as well. I forget what they labelled those as.
Yes, referencing. Yeah,
referencing.
Yeah. So you're paying the letting agents their job basically as a tenant, in addition to paying the landlord the I suppose the rent and the deposits and things, which the letting agent will get a percentage of it. So it was double dipping on the agent's part, would be my perspective. But
yeah, it certainly.
There's a lot of that.
In London, it got very silly. Your Foxtons type of agents, and other agents are available, but they were particularly
not as expensive.
Yes. And it was ridiculous, but capping it would have been, I believe, a much more grown-up way of dealing with it.
I think one of the difficulties, whichever way it happens, it ends up on the tenant paying it, because there's nowhere else for it to come from. So it's ended up now in increasing rents.
Yeah, but you see, this is another thing where overtly this government is looking to win the tenant vote whilst covertly charging them in terms of rent.
Yes. I've actually, would it be helpful? I've pulled up one of the government documents on the disallowed fees. I'll just whiz us through that.
Yeah, go for
it. Viewing fees. Can I ask a tenant to pay a fee to view a property? No. Can I charge a tenant for setting up a new tenancy? No. Can I charge a tenant for an inventory? No. Can I charge a tenant to check out at the end of a tenancy? No. Can I charge a tenant for a professional clean at the end of a tenancy? No. Can I charge a tenant for checking out on a Saturday or out of hours or evening? No. Can a tenant's previous landlord charge me, the landlord, to provide a reference? That one's yes, because that's to the landlord. And it just goes on and on. There's loads and loads of things that were being charged that now cannot.
So basically all you can charge is rent. And that's it.
It's almost. I've got that list.
Agent doesn't charge rent.
No, the letting agent wasn't. But yeah, the allowed fees list is very short. The only fees that a landlord can charge a tenant are the rent, a refundable tenancy deposit, a refundable holding deposit, and a payment associated with early termination of the tenancy when requested by the tenant. And that's about it. Oh, and a default fee for late payment of rent or replacement of a key if it's specifically stated in the tenancy agreement. And it then says, if any fee you are charging is not on this list that I just read, it's a prohibited payment and you should not charge it. Very, very short list.
Now one of the underlying bases of this is that they're looking to improve, or when I say they, the government are looking to improve access to housing for tenants. I'd like your thoughts on how that's working out, and are things substantially better for tenants versus 2 or 3 years ago? We'll start with you, Phil.
That's a difficult one. It certainly makes it easier at the application stage. And because the other thing we've not mentioned is deposits were getting out of hand as well. Some agents were charging 3 months rent as deposits. Now that's now been limited to 5 weeks worth, or 6 if it's a very expensive property, but for most people it's 5. So you've not got to find a massive amount of money up front. It really was getting quite ridiculous. So I guess that's helped. On the other hand, it's now become much more difficult to weed out using finances to weed out people that you don't want. So it's a two-edged sword, I guess.
It kind of brings up.
Well, I think also you see the tenant can apply for half a dozen properties now because it doesn't cost him to do so.
That's
so
true.
There's a lot of abortive applications if you're a letting agent. You know, literally, if you've got a row of shops, you could apply for a property with each of the shops down the high street and choose which one you wanted. So all of those those letting agents are set to work on work they're not going to be paid for.
That's very true, because they've got their admin for showing people round. They've probably got a referencing fee before the offer is firm.
Referencing fee, which they're having to pay. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, before we kind of kicked off the podcast, you mentioned, Phil, that your perspective on charging deposits, you were more for not charging deposits. Love to get your opinion on that, or your perspective.
Okay, so deposits have become a very dangerous place to be. We act for an awful lot of landlords who haven't understood that they now need to protect their deposit with one of the 3 government-backed schemes and do so within 30 days. Otherwise, they are liable to a fine or a repayment, in fact, to the tenant of between 1 and 3 times the deposit. And there's an awful lot of these no-win, no-fee lawyers that used to be doing PPI and now needed something else to do. So if you look on the internet, there are loads of adverts for people offering to do no-win, no-fee rent deposit reclaims. So landlords are getting stung by this left, right, and centre, because not only are landlords failing to protect deposits, so you've probably seen all the hoo-ha about purple bricks, who have failed to protect the deposits of thousands of landlords, And it's not Purple Bricks that are liable in this case, it's the landlord. They've made the landlord at risk for a massive amount of money. Now, the other thing, and this is a bit more hearsay, is that the deposit protection schemes, they have a tendency to come down on the side of the tenant, not the landlord. Now, when I put those two things on a balance, I go 3 times risk of having to pay back 3 times the deposit. And it's so easy to get wrong. There's a lot of hoops to jump through with the prescribed information and getting things in on time and then giving the information to the tenants. It's so easy to get wrong unless you've got a really good letting agent doing it for you. I would never now recommend that a landlord does it themselves. And on the other side, you've got very little benefit because you're not going to get the money anyway. So my preference and my advice to landlords these days is just put a clause in your contract that they are responsible for any damage and breakages, and take a guarantor and go through it that way. Either get the money from the guarantor or take them out on a money claim online. But the risk to me of having a deposit, there's very little benefit from it, and there's so much that can go wrong.
Yeah, but you just slipped in the key thing, which is the guarantor. If there is no guarantor available, Phil, and no deposit, what the heck is stopping the tenant from behaving exactly as he wants? If he's got some money in the game, then at least there should be a deterrent effect. But I think the guarantor is very, I would go without a deposit if I had a guarantor, a home owning guarantor. But
yeah, there's an awful lot of people now, me included, that even if there is no guarantor, still won't take the deposit because you're not going to get your hands on it, and it's just not worth the candle.
It was the deterrent effect rather than the reality that I would stand on.
I don't believe that exists, to be honest, Sue, anymore, because there's so much publicity now. Tenants are so wise as to what they can. I was going to use the word screw, but what they can take their landlords for, and they all know about rent repayment orders. They come in their droves. They actually set landlords up for rent repayment orders. They check out before they move in whether the property's licensed, find out it isn't, move in, stay 12 months, and then claim back 12 months rent. We get loads of those cases. Deposit protection cases, landlords are clueless and they don't protect them properly. They think they can put the money in their own ISA, and that's protected. No, it's not. And they get hit with these 3 times deposit repayments. And tenants are so well clued up now.
There's a definite, in my view, I think the fact that there's an independent, and you could argue how independent are they, but there is an independent regulated body that looks after that money. I think that's a good thing. Now, in terms of whether you should take it or not, that's a separate question. And in the shameless plug that we've got to get in at least once within a sponsored version of this, Landlord Studio's got an ability to not only administer but provide evidence when you get into trouble regarding the taking of deposits and the scheme. Because what does the judge ask you, Sue Maxwell Smith, when you're hauled up in court and your ethics have been called into question as a landlord, and they're asking about the deposit?
I have no idea. I've never been there, Will.
Neither have I, for that matter. But the question would be, show me the evidence.
Absolutely. It's got to be the evidence that the prescribed information was served at the correct times and that the deposit was protected within the 30 days allowed.
And let's be very clear on those bits. So you've got to have an ability to receipt that you've received it. You've got to have to deposit it. You've got to document that you have deposited it, and you've got to document that you've shared the information with the tenant within, and all within the relevant timelines and guidelines within the Act. Now, what does that mean? So you think about the average, and we'll just take the average across England. When you peel it all back, you're talking about an average cash flow, net cash flow of somewhere between 150 and maybe 250 per property. Your stock standard buy-to-let, and we've all both got and come across monthly cash flows that are far in excess of that, and we've also come across ones that are far below that. If you're talking about a month's rent or 5 weeks, and if you're talking 3 times that could very quickly be more than your year's profit. That's a hell of a risk in my view.
Yeah, and if you're doing fixed term tenancies, then it can be for each successive tenancy. So we've seen people charged 8 times, 9 times because there've been multiple tenancies, same tenant, same property.
Wow, I hadn't thought of that, Phil.
There's I don't know, I've got one on my desk here.
It's another argument against renewing, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. In fact,
because
when it first started out, you had to reprotect it, even when it went from fixed term onto periodic, and everybody fell foul of that. Thankfully, that's now changed, and it does at least roll forward.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I don't reissue tenancies.
Yeah, there was a case, it's not working with the thing there, but there's one landlord here who was sued by his tenant for 83,000 because there were 4 follow-on tenancies times 4 times 3 times whatever the rent was. He ended up getting less than that, but he still got about 8 times, 7 or 8 times, massive amount of money. And
that could destroy someone's business.
Yeah, we see a lot of cases like that coming through our firm, and to be honest, we don't let such things usually go to court. We negotiate settlements because it's just too expensive, too difficult, too dangerous to end up in court over it. And but yeah, there can be quite frightening amounts of money.
And for the average, I think amateur or smaller styled landlord, they wouldn't have walked past a courthouse, let alone been inside and been effectively accused of being a criminal. And that in itself, I think, is it's a pretty big fear factor, and people don't necessarily think about that when they're getting into becoming a landlord. And indeed, if you look at it's approximately 17% of the housing stock is held in the private rented sector, and the vast majority of landlords have certainly got under 5 properties. And I'm sure you've got some stats on this, Phil Turtle, but I suspect the vast majority have actually only got 1 rental property.
It's something like 80% have 4 or less. Yeah,
80% have 4 or less, and within that, I suspect that over half of those would only have one rental property in addition to their own home residence.
Very likely to be accidental landlords, I'd imagine.
Yeah, and you can see how, and we've spoken previously about the 178 pieces of UK legislation that you've got to be compliant with. Now, within that, there's vast reams of clauses, of aspects, of nuances, and that's before you start getting into the local authorities' interpretations, their regulations within your local area where you're operating your property business, which it must be. And if you're a busy person, you might have another career, you might have other interests, you might have friends and family that would like some attention rather than reading up on this stuff. It's very easy to get into trouble, and quite serious trouble very quickly. What would be a couple of examples of people that see, and I'll get Phil to chip in, where people have effectively run aground on the rocks below the surface as they're coming through the harbour entrance, the safe harbour entrance, and there's been a bit of a storm that's blown them onto the rocks.
To be honest, I don't think I know anybody personally who's suffered a rent repayment order or a court case brought by a tenant. But I may do and just not talked about it. Myself, earlier in my career, I had a situation where I found a tenant personally. I usually use agents, but I found a tenant personally and was slow in protecting the deposit, and her father tackled me about it and I paid them. But I've never been to court about it, and that was years and years ago, and it wasn't long after the change of the tenancy deposit scheme arrangements. And I had protected it, I just missed the 30-day window. But he came to me for 3 times the deposit, and rather than having a stink, I decided to pay them.
And that's usually the best way, because otherwise, you're going to end up potentially with a criminal record, because all of these things under the Housing Act, deposit protection falls under the Housing Act, as does all the management regulations for HMOs, the housing health and safety rating system, health and safety for every rental property, and actually every boat, caravan, and your own home that you live in comes under the same act. But all of those things, any transgression is a criminal act. It's horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. Everything we as landlords do. I mean, there's one thing you can guarantee: we are all criminals, because you cannot possibly keep on top of all this stuff. I mean, in our firm, I don't think there's one person that really would claim to know all of it. We have our specialisms. I concentrate on more on the housing health and safety side and the management regulations, but there's a raft of other stuff. Tenant Fees Act. I mean, that in itself is what, 60 pages, and that's just one thing. The
tenant fees, 60 pages.
Yeah, well, I think it's just it's just horrendous. And,
That's
and
amazing.
the Housing Act. Well, the Housing Act's that thick, and it's nearly as interesting as reading a dictionary.
Yes.
But everything in it is a tripwire. It's exactly so. Everything in it is a tripwire. Yeah. And I guess the things we see landlords tripped up on most are 3 and 4 bedroom HMOs that nobody realizes is an HMO. And then they go, oh yeah, but we don't have to license them. Yeah, you're right. But you're covered by the management regulations. Yeah. And I got a landlord up in Salford who had a load of 2 up, 2 downs, 3 up, 2 downs, converted into 5-person HMOs. Yeah. Inadequate, missing fire doors, never got round to it, never knew it was necessary. Inadequate fire alarms. Salford Council comes along and slaps him with a £28,500 fine on regulation 4 of the management regs, safety, plus a load of other stuff. He was looking at 50, 60 grand per property in fines. Wow. And what people also don't realise, not only do the council issue all these fines, they get to keep all the money. Mm. So
they're definitely desperate.
They're a bit motivated to go out and get it.
Like
they're absolutely evil.
I'm not aware of any councils around the country that are going to turn down additional money from any source at the moment. But there's a chronic underfunding of councils, and people sort of forget that that's going on in the background.
No, but they see the landlord as a profit centre now. private
Yeah,
landlord.
exactly, and that there's obviously quite different attitudes between different officers and different councils. Some are overwhelmingly helpful. Like I can think of a number of dealings we've had on all sorts of matters from different departments and various local authorities where I've come away thinking, wow, that was a good customer service experience.
Yeah, but I think
for
there's a north-south divide.
Sorry?
I think there's a north-south divide. I think there's two aspects. In the councils now down south, you don't get the long service people who care about customer service, but also about the town and about the quality of life in the town. I think you get far more temporary people and less capable employees, whereas up north the council job has more status and is more not quite a vocation, that's too strong a word, but what I'm saying is it has a status of its own, being in the housing department at the council. It doesn't in London, it doesn't in the suburbs. And I think that knocks into customer service and sheer humanity, you know, in dealing with both the landlord and the tenant.
Yeah, and I think that's reflective of geography. Like you can live in a house as a council officer, and within a 30-minute drive time in certain locations in and around London, have 5+ potential employers that you could get into their town hall or their main administration buildings. And you go a bit further out into the larger counties, particularly some of the more remote or coastal areas, and you can be a maximum of 1 or 2.
Yes.
And the movement between boroughs is far more common for council officers. So people often focus on the executive levels where you're talking about big businesses, like relatively small councils that might be covering population areas of, in some of the home county boroughs, that they can be as low or even below 100,000 people. But they've got £1 billion commercial property operations, that they've got large scale schemes, but they have to find a way of generating revenue to cover all of the aspects that another borough that they're maybe 15 miles away from is covering a population centre in the hundreds and hundreds of thousands, with all the accompanying revenue and I suppose additional compliance at the same time, but the coverage of offices is different. Now, in simple terms, like the larger the population base of the local authority area, I suppose the easier it is to staff it in some sense, but also at the same time, the more likely there is to be a turnover of staff. And I think your point, Sue, is that there's a lack of connection necessarily as a result of that, where culturally people are perhaps more aligned to their personal career than building their personal career within the council. Is that loosely what you were meaning?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've been dealing with some of the Northeast councils, and the continuity there, I can email the same girl, whereas down south you don't have a personal connection, in that I think they have a sort of pool of work. It may even be outsourced, I don't know. And you get more of a call center type of lifestyle there and mentality. And there's a sort of workflow set up, almost like using Zendesk, you know, and it lacks quality because people don't understand the case.
I'd suggest it's actually, sadly, even worse than that, Sue, because what we're seeing happen is that the sort of people that that Will was describing, the old hands, the EHOs, environmental health officers, housing, well qualified, well experienced, very interested in improving quality of the housing stock for the tenants and taking landlords gently along with them to achieve what they want to achieve. They're being phased out. They're being pushed out. We see lots of these lovely old people being pushed out, and they're bringing in a new breed that they call enforcement officers. Their only job is to collect revenue. They know nothing about housing. And do you know what? We see them so often. They will leave tenants in mortal danger in houses that I would close down until they get their management regulations, £60,000, £100,000 fines. It's absolutely horrendous. But that's because it's all going for the money. They're now driven by the finance department. They're not interested in housing. They're just interested in money.
Well,
hence the dragon behind me.
Yeah, and I think that's you know, it's spot on in terms of that that understanding around the case. There's also another layer of management within the councils, and there's partly like their ability to cover more cases. So I have there's an ongoing issue with a tenancy that we've inherited from a purchase, where there's a young lad who has autism and is in we think a suboptimal situation, and you know, he'd be better placed in some form of supported living facility, and the adult social services are in agreement with us. We had a tenancy related query a few weeks back where we were looking to gain access to the property to get the compliance done for, I can't remember if it was the gas or electric, you know, certificates, and that we were looking to organise that in advance. And the caseworker within the adult social care had been very good and very, I think, mindful of both us and the tenant. And she was on leave, and I got shipped up the line to her boss's boss, and this is a person who is effectively covering this section of adult social care for the county. So they've got multiple team leaders underneath, multiple caseworkers within each of the teams, multiple locations, and he was absolutely familiar with the detail and history of the case, what was going on with the person, where it was headed, wanted to know a couple of details around the current quality of accommodation, and was supportive of the compliance issues, even though it wasn't a housing department brief. And that's a classic example of what you've described as a Northern Council, but I think more importantly, like where there's a genuine public service, there's ethos, there's and you might say a job for life, but I think that might be unfairly characterising it, but there's a professionalisation of
yes.
Of the process. There's a duty of care, and this is not to cast aspersions on other councils where there's higher turnover. They have that same duty of care, but in practical terms, it's harder to do when you've got a big turnover. It's harder to do when you're dealing with tens of thousands of cases versus, you know, perhaps hundreds within your local authority area as a council thing. Now, what does this mean for landlords? Do you think, Sue Maxwell Smith? Is it buy up
Well,
north?
it's frightening to hear. I mean, it sounds like I've been lucky, but I am fairly careful. And, you know, as I said, I made a mistake myself, but years ago, but I've never had a compliance visit, and I don't really fancy one, thank you. But it does frighten me how many people are pouring into buy to let who only see the numbers because they've learned about it through lockdown on YouTube, and you have no talk of tenants at all, only of rent. And I think, if anything, the quality of landlords is dropping again. You know, we have the old school guys who are disconnected, you know, from everything, who have been landlords since the 60s, who are now retiring. But the newcomers, I haven't a clue, I'm afraid. And it seems to be all about the money. And it's an alternative to cryptocurrency, which of course is fundamentally at the other end of the detail spectrum in terms of needing to understand all the other aspects, because people's lives are at risk here and they don't get it, you know.
Absolutely.
And it frightens me a lot, that does. And you know, it seems worse and worse each day that there are people, you know, saying my tenant hasn't paid rent, it was due yesterday, it's now 8:30 in the morning, can I change the locks? And nobody has told him that that, you know, for instance, only the tenant or the court can end a tenancy. He hasn't a clue. He sees it entirely in the money sense, and is totally reliant on getting the rent in, and other people's lives don't seem to matter. And you know, I've said before that I believe that landlords ought to be licensed, because you wouldn't fly a plane without a license. I don't think you should be a landlord without a license. And I think being appraised of the 180 rules would put a great number of people off. And I think that's right. Because otherwise, you know, Phil, you're going to get fatter.
Well, yes. And you know what? Although we do all this because somebody needs to do it, because landlords do get themselves into so much of a pickle. It shouldn't. My job shouldn't need to exist. It really shouldn't. Exactly. If landlords understood or got professional advice, and if they found out how to make their properties compliant with health and safety, we wouldn't have most of this stuff. But unfortunately, nobody actually educates them, and they won't pay for any education. They won't, they won't pay for improvements, most of them. And actually, unfortunately, this goes for a lot of the old school guys. You know what, we see a lot of old school landlords being absolutely ripped to shreds by the councils, because you know, they're of that era where you didn't do much, you didn't spend a lot of money on it, you didn't replace anything until it absolutely broke. And those, you know, the council has a field day with those. They're not rogue landlords. They're not decent people, but they're just the old-fashioned tight landlord. And there's no room for that anymore. You will get ripped to shreds if you're that sort of landlord now. It's such a different thing. Such a different
the other change is the rise of the starving council at, you know, and the two things, of course, are a pincer movement, aren't they?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
You've got amateur landlords who, quite frankly, are amateurs and shouldn't be in the game, and you have desperate councils, and the two, you know, the obvious target for the council is landlords in general, and it catches the people who generally mean well.
Yeah, I've actually, just for a bit of
I'm
fun
not
and
paranoid,
background,
but they are out to get you.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that I've managed to infiltrate a couple of enforcement officer training courses, and they actually teach them that we landlords are all criminals. I said at the start, we are actually all criminals, because you can't stay over all of this stuff. And it's a bit like driving at 72, 75 on the motorway. Eventually they'll get you. They will get you.
Yeah.
Now there's an enormous aspect of, and this is the second shameless plug. We got a bonus one for you this week, Logan. It's one thing to be compliant, but to be able to demonstrate that after the fact, that you've got your administration in order. Landlord Studio is a very simple, easy to use app. You can look them up. There's loads of reviews. They've won various accolades and awards. I think there's you're over 30,000 properties going into 2022. What the basic sort of premise in relation to this is, what it does is it captures information, particularly financial information and compliance information. Now it relies on you to be compliant and to upload information occasionally, but it's there in one place. It's telling you that you need your gas certificate done, that it needs to be booked in. I think you've got new services where you can actually book the gas certificate inspection, etc., online on your app, and that's another area where they charge like wounded bulls. The old gas safety inspection certificates. We've got one going on at the moment where we've got a portfolio where we had about 30 residential properties that needed the inspections done, the certificates reissued, and so the letting agent or the property manager got access, got through all of them. I think they had to do it over several days because there was some tenants that had night shift or for whatever reason, and they got round and they got all of the certificates issued and the copy given to each of the tenants. But we didn't get our copy for, I think we had to chase them about 12 or 13 times to get our copy and ask him to issue his invoice, which is, but until we have that copy in our hands or the, emailed to us, we're technically in breach. If there was, and God forbid something went wrong with the gas and there was an accident, there was a fire, I doubt that you would find the certificate turning up subsequently, to that fire. And the property manager had a statement which I almost fell off my chair laughing when I heard. Was that, well, no, there's a copy that he gave the tenant. That's a lot of use if there was a fire in the property. Now, I shouldn't make light of fires or compliance, but having the paperwork in your hand, having the dates lined up, having documentation around when was that passed on, this absolutely applies as far as deposit taking and release and the protections around that. Now, I personally think it's a good thing they've got the legislation around deposits, and I think that the tenant fees were certainly too far one way. They may have gone too far the other way, and as Sue is very fond of saying, and I agree with this, someone has to pay, and ultimately it will be the tenant. And the objective, I think, was to make it easier on a financial basis for tenants to get access to rental properties. And I don't know that, when you're going to look back in another 2 or 3 years, whether that will be the case, because it will be in some shape or form reflected back in increased rents, and those are ultimately borne by the tenant, which was not, necessarily the only objective of the legislation. Now, we might do a little sum up you know, of what we're taking away, and what, you know, what's one or two things that, you know, a landlord can do. And we won't limit it to tenant fees because there's not much you can do as far as tenant fees these days. So we'll kick off with you, Sue, if you don't mind, just summing up. And
yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that you've missed about higher rents is of course there's then tax for the government, because the landlord won't carry on doing it if he's not making a profit, and that profit will be taxable. So the government is not only apparently helping the tenant to have access to all rental properties, but they are again serving their purpose to collect tax. What am I taking away from this? More terror from Phil, really. and his prediction that it'll get me one day. Maybe I paid my little due with my 3 times 300 quid or whatever it was at the time. I think it was 300 quid in a cheap property in Lincolnshire. But, you know, it's frightening, isn't it, that with the enforcement people out there who won't eat unless they catch someone. Bit worrying.
Yeah, it is. And I think you know, it needs to be said that if somebody as experienced as yourself, Sue, can get caught out by that, that just underlines how easy it is for what we should call the amateur landlords to get caught out by it. So one thing I would say to the amateur landlords, for goodness sake, find yourself a decent ALA qualified letting agent. Don't try doing it yourself. It's just too damned complicated.
Yeah.
It may seem, you know, you've got to give away 10 or 11 or 12%. Yeah, do it, because otherwise the costs, the fines that people are looking at and getting these days are just so horrendous, particularly on HMOs, for goodness sake. HMOs is a dangerous business to be in. And it's the one that all these gurus are teaching these people, I have to say it, off the streets. Oh, you can get into rent to rent with no money. Yeah, but you're facing 30, 40, 60,000 pound fines if you get it wrong. You're done. You're finished. You're bankrupt. Sorry, Sue. I'm doing scare again. I must stop.
Set me up well for the day.
I'm just in terror from what Phil's saying to me. So I think it just again highlights that whole issue of a lot of these landlords coming into the game with no real education around how to properly run rental properties and avoid these fines and do it correctly. So I guess my takeaway is that get some education, get some proper advice, proper legal advice, proper tax advice, and really treat it like a proper business, so you don't get caught out with all these fines, and don't watch YouTube videos of these gurus trying to, you know, make money off you at the end of the day,
showing off their Ferraris. Yeah,
they're just selling courses.
Yeah. Because it is such a passive investment category, isn't it? Property.
Absolutely, yeah. No. Yeah, anybody that tells you that is definitely selling you the shiny penny. Property's hard work, isn't it, Sue?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Even if you have a letting agent, you still need to make sure you're compliant and make sure you've got the right guys. I mean, in my experience, they're either quite good with the tenants and the property and the paperwork, the accounting's a bit peculiar, or it's the other way around. I haven't managed to find a firm really, apart from the one ALA one I've got, where both of them are pretty spot on. Although their property managers tend to side with the tenant. I've screamed at a few of them over the years. you know, the tenant asked if he could have a new shower, and I told him that you'd probably be all right with it. Oh, thanks, pal. Who are you representing?
But one of the things that I think I'd encourage all landlords to at least have a look at over the course of the next number of weeks and months is have a look at what's going on in your local area and other categories of property. What's happening commercially? What's happening with the retail? What's happening within the area in terms of what's the community looking like? Where's that headed? And people often talk about the ability as an investor to see around the corner, and they talk about it as if it's some sort of witch doctor exercise. You know, everyone has access to the same information. There's obviously a lot of uncertainty in the world around what's happening with the pandemic and what does that mean in terms of all sorts of things. I've seen some stats recently on the London commercial property market, and there's been some enormous leases signed. In Q3 of 2021, which is the most recent full quarter of stats, they had multiple leases of over 100,000 square feet. The largest was over 300,000 square feet. You add those up, and very quickly you're in the millions of square feet let in London commercial property. Now, who's taking those? Big businesses that have chosen to have big offices, and those offices are going to be staffed by people. And interestingly enough, most of the large-scale leasing are for new operations. So they're going to have new hires going into these spaces. Now, what does that mean? There's going to be more people hired. Now, whether they're in the office full-time or they're in 1 day a week or 3 days a week, I don't know. But it does mean that that there's a vote for in big companies, and people often focus on the number of small companies that are out there, the level of employment. The average small company probably has somewhere between 2 and 3 staff, including the founder. There's companies that are taking space where there's hundreds and in some cases thousands or even tens of thousands of people going into leasing arrangements. What that means in terms of the dynamics, because all these people are going to need somewhere to live. And that's a good thing. There's a flow-on effect, there's a changing effect. What does that mean for the commuter belt towns? Because that will typically, a large portion of those people will live, within a shorter commute, within zones 1 to 6, and that puts pressure on accommodation in those areas. People who are perhaps at a different stage of life then look to move out into the commuter areas, which uplifts values. It changes the dynamics of the retail centres, the town centres within those, which then flows out into villages, and you start getting a viability of development of estates within, I suppose, those, and that keeps going further and further out. Now, what does this mean, in 2022? Have a look around. What's going on in your local area, and I think it doesn't take that long, but you do have to stop and think about it, and you do have to do a little bit of research. And my view, being in property is a choice. if you have chosen to do it, make the most of it, or make a dignified, well-structured, well-planned exit or partial exit, or changing how your involvement is based, but do it consciously. So thank you very much to Logan Ransley, sponsor from Landlord Studio, and Sue Maxwell Smith, UK Property World, accountancy practice owner and long-standing portfolio landlord. And our special guest today, Phil Turtle from Landlord Licensing and Defence. You'll be able to find contact details if you can't find each of the people on LinkedIn or via their websites in the notes for the podcast, or if you're watching this on YouTube. So thanks again, guys. I'm Will Mallard. This is My Property World podcast, and thanks for being on the panel.
Appreciate it, everyone.
Sure.
Thank you.